Hi everyone, this is David and welcome to week 6 of your Executive Certificate program in Business Communications. The title of this week, our last week, is Pulling the Pieces Together. And that shouldn't be too hard for us because all of the pieces really are pulled together by this concept that we've worked on for the last 6 weeks. And that is how to make ourselves more flexible and more adaptable as business communicators. But before we get too much into the weeds, into the details, let's go all the way back to week 1, all the way back, and talk about the first thing that we defined. And that was how business communication was different from all other forms of communication. And we defined that difference as the single purpose of business communication is to get something done. If your communication does not serve to move the ball forward for your team, your group, your company, your whatever, if you are not getting something done, then that business communication needs to be revised. The purpose of business communication is always practical, to get something done. Now, how do we get something done? The thing that overrides or is the umbrella for the entire course is this idea of flexibility. And we started this idea of flexibility with the platinum rule. You remember the platinum rule. Communicate unto others as they wish to be communicated unto. And so what that meant was we first learned how to define different personalities in the workplace. There are many different ways to define them, many different instruments. We used one from Dr. Tony Alessandra, and we divided the communication personalities into directive, supportive, emotive, and reflective. And we did some exercises on understanding those 4 different types and how to adapt our communications to them, whether those communications were one-on-one or whether those communications were to an entire group, whether those communications were in verbal form or whether those communications were in written form. We learned that important flexibility contained in the platinum rule. And then using that, we then branched off first into written communication. We looked especially at emails and how to make emails more effective by making them more adapted to the audience, more audience-friendly, more audience-oriented. And we looked at 10, 13 different ways to make our emails more receptive to our audience. We then looked at facilitating meetings, and we looked especially at conflict management during the facilitation of meetings. We studied the different styles of conflict management, identified our own predominant styles, but more importantly, we learned that when we are facilitating meeting, we have to force ourselves to recognize the kind of decision that has to be made, the time frame in which it has to be made, and what management style best fits all of those parameters. And I mean all of those parameters. And that had to do with conflict management styles, whether you were an avoider, or whether you were a confronter, whether you were a compromiser, whether you were, I don't know, whatever you were. But that is a form of adaptability whenever you manage conflict. Then, most recently, we started looking at presentations. And we learned some important new rules about presentations. One of the most important new rules we learned is that how slides can alienate our audience by not allowing us to adapt ourselves to the audience. So we learned some new forms of talking to the audience, sometimes with slides, sometimes without slides. We learned that we or the presentation. And we learned that the focus of that presentation is not slides, it's not bullet points, it's not any of that stuff. The focus of the presentation is that person or persons sitting in front of us. We learned the important rule of never speak to a stranger. In other words, even though you're speaking to a group you've never talked to before, we talked about the importance of getting to know that group first, even if it means standing in front of the doorway and greeting them as they came in. Because presentations are all about connection between yourself and the audience. And so, to wrap it all up, we learned how to be flexible. We learned that business communications has a very specific purpose, and we learned how to adapt ourselves, whether it is in speaking, whether it is in writing, whether it is in presentations. We learned to adapt ourselves to the audience. And that takes us full circle to something I told you on the very first time that we got together. And that something was, there are no rules. The audience rules. And as long as we are adapting ourselves to the audience, as long as we are thinking to ourselves that all I need to be is authentic, all I need to be is honest, and all I need to be is connected to that individual or individuals in front of me. And you know what that leads to? It leads to executive presence. That ability to truly, sincerely, authentically communicate to the human being standing in front of you because you understand them, you have empathy for them, and you're customizing your message for them. Okay, so that's the video for this week. You're going to be getting into some week 6 materials. You're being introduced to one concept for the first time, crisis communication. I'm going to post a video on that in your discussion board for you to look at. But overall, your job this week is to reflect back upon the course, what you learned, and more importantly, how you're going to change your communication in the future for the better. Okay, I'll see you guys in class.